I'm the last survivor of the Holocaust in our family.
Behind the words, pictures, and artifacts in the museum are people whose stories of survival and hope come alive to inspire new generations of upstanders. One by one, these stories stir the soul.
Can there really be hope for us?
Simon is 4018. My sister was 4017.
Holocaust survivors, their descendants, liberators, champions of justice, and courageous upstanders ask only this: hear my story, so that the lessons they teach will echo for generations.
I will never meet someone else like my father. But there are many of us who, if we come together, can keep his voice alive.
These stories will change you. They will move you to action, inspiring the best of humanity every day. I'm Jackie Congedo, and in this episode, you'll hear from 3 generations of women who share their reflection on lives upended by the Holocaust. Helen Kaltman was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1937. When the war began, she and her parents fled to the Soviet Union and were then deported to Siberia. Throughout the war, Helen's family suffered lengthy separations, hunger, illness, and the loss of many extended family members. Miraculously, Helen and her parents survived and looked to the future of rebuilding their lives. In Israel is where Helen says her life began. It's where she met her future husband, Simon. Helen and Simon ultimately settled in Cincinnati, where they raised their family. Their daughter, Elana, and granddaughter, Ariel, join Helen to bear witness to this remarkable family story and the strength and love Helen has shown throughout her life.
Good afternoon, ladies. Thank you so much for being with me today to do this very special segment of Hear My Story. I'm so excited to dive into your family's history, but then also how together we will keep this story alive. So again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being with me. And Helen, my first question goes to you. You are a Holocaust survivor who survived with your parents. But before we really get into your story, I'm curious and I know you were very young as well, can you share anything you know about pre-war life in Warsaw, Poland, what your family was like and growing up?
I don't have a lot to share then. I was 2 years old when the Germans came into Warsaw. And somehow, now that I'm 87 years old, I can hear how the Germans walked with it came back now. When I go to sleep, comes back to me. And I see my parents and I see myself as a baby. And that's how it started.
And I know today faith is very important to you. Were your family very observant?
Yes, they were. I know that my grandfather, from my mother's side, was very, very frum. And he came to New York with his oldest son, and he stayed here a year. And he said that the Jews here are not observant enough. And he went back to Poland, and he got killed like everybody else. I don't remember any of my family, but I remember the names. And thank God, Elana and her sister were good enough, and Ariel, to name the kids after my whole family that went. I knew the names because my mother and father were alive, but I don't remember anybody from my family.
I'm so sorry to hear that, but thank you for sharing. I know a lot of what we'll talk about today is hard, and I'm just so thankful that you're willing to share this with us so that hopefully we can learn from your experience and this history. I know you mentioned the Germans coming into Poland, and eventually you and your family end up in Uzbekistan, and you and your mother really survived the war together. You're separated from your father, who's conscripted into the Soviet army. Can you tell me how How did your mother keep things together, keep you and her together safe? And how did you survive the war together with your mother?
Well, first I was in a few places in Russia until I came to Uzbekistan. And when the Russians came, they sent us to Siberia. And in Siberia, my father was not together with my mother. They were in a different camp, and my mother was in a different camp, and I was in a different camp. And then one day, it was before the war, as soon as we came to Siberia, my mother got a letter that somehow my aunt can smuggle me back to Poland. She was a doctor and she worked for the Russians. The man used to smuggle back to the women's camp, and he decided that they have to run away from there. And we went on a train. My parents had some jewelry, and we went all around Russia. For 3 months we went on the train and we didn't know where we were going then. And it was a lot of survivors like us from Poland that ran away. And then I got to Uzbekistan. As soon as we got to Uzbekistan, they took my father away. And he was in the army. And my mother and myself were in Uzbekistan. And she worked from morning to night for a piece of bread until the end of the war. And then my father came, and I didn't recognize him. And I was screaming, "Dada, it's in Russian. Please go away, I'm not your daughter." And one time I heard a man crying. And I went out to him and I told him, I said, "Why are you crying?" And he said, "I had a little girl that I loved her very, very much. And now she doesn't want me anymore. She doesn't love me. She doesn't want me." I told him, "She's a very mean little girl, but I will love you." And I loved my father. I loved him with my whole heart until he passed away. He was a very good man.
And so patient and understanding because you were so young. So being through what you and your mother went through and then reuniting with your father, which is incredible that you all were able to survive and reunite after the war. It is heartbreaking to hear that you didn't recognize him, but how beautiful that rebuilt relationship with your father.
We went away. We ran away from there and we went to Poland. A lot of survivors, Polish people, survivors, Jews probably. We went back to Poland. And when we came back there, they wanted to kill us. And my mother had a nervous breakdown. And she cried all the time. I can hear the blood. And my father used to tell her, "You don't hear the blood, you look at the blood." And she really was sick. She had a very hard time. And there were people that worked from Israel, and they smuggled us over to Germany. And from Germany, we can go to Israel.
One thing you mentioned that I did want to ask you about is, you know, through a lot of our tours, we see thousands, especially students, that come through our museum. And one of the misconceptions is that the war was over, everything went back to normal, anti-Semitism miraculously disappeared. And what I'm hearing from you.
Then when it really started, let us live in the same area, and the parents went every day to a place that was a big list of the survivors. Every survivor told their name, and it went in every place the Jews were. My parents used to go every day, and they didn't find anything. Nobody was survived, because my mother was from a little town, And my father was near Warsaw. A lot of Jews in Warsaw were dead.
Yeah, it's what I'm hearing from that is one, the ongoing danger for survivors going back to their homes. I know in another time you and I spoke, you talked about being met with sticks and stones and people really intimidating and making your family feel unwelcome in
Not
the
only
very place you were
unwelcome,
from.
but scared to live.
But then another thing you touch on is that ongoing trauma and how hard it was for survivors to rebuild and to try to go on and live normal lives. And before we really talk about the next part of your story and DP camps and then eventually even going to Israel, I wanted to ask Ariel, when you hear your grandmother's story and the trauma and the pain and everything that she describes, on the flip side of that, it also took immense strength, right? But not only of her mother, but also of her and her father as well. And I'm just wondering, what do you hear in your grandmother's story, or what do you admire most about the character strengths that she's sharing through her story?
What really sticks out is her love for family and her parents. And like she said, it really does stick out to me that my grandmother and grandfather said every day they would go and look at this list to just hope that somebody was alive, and just never giving up on the idea of if there was even a speckle of a chance that somebody could be alive, they had to find them and reconnect and make sure they were okay. And I think that I was really always touched when my grandmother told me about her mom having a nervous breakdown, circling back to, how her mother survived during this with her. I have no idea. I mean, she just kept going on when she probably had nothing left to give, having a nervous breakdown. And I'm sure she was fairly young, had a baby, and just how people always say, I don't know how they did it, I don't know how they survived, but they didn't have any choice. They just kept going. So it's just inspiring that even when you're at rock bottom, somehow you kind of gravel up and continue for your children and your family.
Yeah, I hear love and definitely hope, right? That hope that they would survive, be reunited with Kissel, right? Your father, a hope that this will pass and we will once again be together as a family. So I think that is so beautiful to pull out of this story that really is just so dark and so tragic. And Elana, I'm curious, when do you recall first realizing that your parents were Holocaust survivors and you really started kind of understanding this piece of your family's history?
I was pretty young because I remember my cousin Sandy said to me, that the grandmother we have in Israel is not our real grandmother. She's a step-grandmother. And I said, well, what happened to our grandmother? And she said she was killed. And that was all she said about it. But I knew there were a lot of secrets that I wasn't allowed to know. And I distinctly remember my grandparents, my mother's parents, we were in Israel with them and we were visiting their friends. And their friends came in and started to talk about, we need to tell them what happened to us. They need to know. And my grandmother got so mad and she said, you can't tell them. You can't, they can't ever know. Don't talk about it. And then also I remember my dad would drift off, like in the ozone, like just sit there and stare into space. And I knew instinctively as a kid, don't ask him what he's thinking about. It was just little things like that. So I think I always knew that there was a terrible, dark secret that I'm not allowed to ask about.
And as you through the years, learn more and more, I'm wondering, when did you then share with your children? And then Ariel, if you could follow up, what have you shared with your children now, or have you yet?
When my father started to get sick, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's when he was 65. And I think that it kind of drew in that he does have a mortality here. And then he started to tell me more and more about what happened to him. And he would say, write it down. So I would get out a piece of paper and he would dictate to me and I would write it down. And I think he started to share stories with me and my sister, and I know with the grandchildren. So that's when we really started talking about it. My mom really never did talk about it too much. I think that my mom had a lot of trauma. And as an adult, I can see she absorbed the anxiety and the brokenness of her parents on top of her own brokenness, and then being married to someone who had been through the horrors of concentration camps. I think it made you very anxious in general, and we kind of Yafa and I were always felt like we had to protect our parents.
I would imagine that it probably was lightly talked about always. My youngest now is 6 years old, or my oldest, I'm sorry, my oldest is 6, and he asked me about what I was talking to Bubby about. And so I told him that I was talking about the Holocaust, and he said to me, "What's a Holocaust?" And it was so weird because I'm like, wow, this is a kid who obviously doesn't know what the Holocaust is. And I said it was a very bad time in the world, and it's when a very evil man named Hitler was trying to hurt the Jews and the Nazis. And I told him a little background, but gently, like, but Bubby's family survived, and this is why we have to be proud Jews now, and, stuff. It's very gentle, but just a general gist of it. And so I would think that probably my mom always said stuff like that, like, there was a time where people were trying to hurt my parents. And so I don't ever remember this big, like, sit down conversation. It was just, yeah. I was just always something that I knew about. And so I feel like with my children, I think that it'll always just be something they know about, and then it'll kind of grow as far as to, like, really what that means. So now, my son knows what the Holocaust is, but does he know the extent of it? No, but we'll always continue to build on it.
We already touched on this a little bit, that you were with your mother during the war and separated from your father, and the trauma, the immense trauma that your mother had through a nervous breakdown after the war. And I know you were very close with your father and rebuilt that relationship with him. Did he speak very much about his experience with you in the Army and his experience?
No, he talked about the family, the names, and who they were, what they did, and nothing what he went through. But he wanted me to know the family.
When you think of your parents and everything, I asked Ariel to what we call strength spot, right? What does she hear in your story about the personal strengths? What strengths do you see in your parents?
My mother was a very strong woman. And before they caught my father and sent him away, they had to work, plant trees. If they did not plant that amount that they were supposed, they didn't get anything to eat. So she used to take a bunch of it and put it all together and close it up. And my father said, if they catch you, they will kill you. And she said, this is life. I remember this all the time. She used to say, I'm hungry, I will do everything to bring my child a piece of bread. And I had a very hard time when we were in Uzbekistan. I was very sick. And then when we came to Poland, it was kids like from 5 until I think at that time I was 8, something like this. We were talking to understand what our parents, why are they crying all the time? We understood our parents tried to send us to a regular school, and they used to say, Židi, Židi, dirty Židi, dirty Jews. And I used to come home and I used to wash myself. My mother said, why are you washing yourself? I said, they tell me that I'm dirty, maybe I smell it. And my mother used to say, you smell good, you are okay, and start crying. She was crying a lot. And then when we were in Germany, all the time, I didn't have a life. I didn't have a life like a child. We were in a camp, and we did not have normal parents. My father used to say, forget it, be good to them. Just be good to them. And my mother said, she has to know. She has to know. And then she changed her mind and she said, nothing happened, nothing happened. So I didn't know what exactly happened. But I knew that something really, really, something awful happened.
And I hear this from survivors a lot. It's an unspoken understanding, right? So it's one thing for you also to be a survivor of Holocaust survivor parents. Maybe there was a level of not needing to talk about that, but you were so young, I'm sure you were curious. And then being in a school system with other survivor children, is that something that you felt you could ask your parents about, or you learned through others' experiences as well, a shared understanding?
Other kids were talking. And then, can I go farther? We went to Israel from there.
And I have lots of Israel questions, so, but go ahead.
My mother couldn't have any more children because of the war. She worked very hard. Whenever she went to a doctor, they used to tell her. And I used to tell my parents, please have a baby. Please have a baby. I want to have a family. I want to belong with a family. And she couldn't have. My friends used to have siblings. So when my mother gave me some money to buy lunch, I used to give it to them to let me go with the buggy. Yeah. And I used to tell myself, these children are mine. Mm. And when I was crying and tell my parents, especially my father, how come I don't have anybody? I only have you and mother, nobody else. And my father used to say, when you grow up, you will get married and you will have a big family, a bigger family than anybody else. And thank God I have nice kids, and they are very nice, very gentle, especially. And I have 20 great-grandchildren.
Oh, wow.
And each one is named after somebody of the family. So my mother, when they were alive, they told me, if you name this person, they were this, she was a blonde, she had blue eyes, you know, something like this. So when I see the kids, the grandchildren, I feel like I did something. And now the situation with what's happening now, I don't sleep nights. I just am scared that my grandchildren will have the same thing like I did.
And because I know we definitely will get into Israel and talk about your life there and of course the rise in anti-Semitism today. I kind of want to close out the part of your life in Poland, and then we'll get there a little bit chronologically. So you touched on something I've never heard you speak about, and that was going back to school and being in with other survivors. And I'm just wondering, do you remember some of the things that were being taught? Because my understanding of the history is the whole school systems changed in what was being taught to children. And I'm just curious if you remember anything about being back in school with both Jewish children and non-Jewish children.
Non-Jewish children, I don't want to remember and I don't want to talk about it. But when I was in Germany 4 years with survivors, only survivors, and we were talking, children were talking. Did your mother tell you this? And I learned a lot about other survivors, other families. And we were very close. All kids were close. And the teachers never taught us about what happened with the Germans. They taught us about Israel, that we will come back to Israel and we will have teachers over there and we will be all Jewish.
So what ultimately led your family to go to the displaced persons camp in Germany? You said you spent 4 years there. How did your family make that decision, especially to go to Germany, the birthplace of Nazism that invaded Poland?
This is the only way that we can go. All the survivors of concentration camps went to Germany because only from Germany we could go to Israel.
So when you left Poland and went to Germany, your family already knew the end goal was to get to Israel. Yes. Okay. What besides the other kids and because really displaced persons camps, we don't hear a lot about kind of the everyday or what life was like. And that's a major aspect of rebuilding for survivor families. That's when many survivors met in displaced persons camp, had children, then immigrated to other countries. What do you remember about that 4 years?
I remember that we could go to other countries, but not to Israel. So every time it was a list. This country wanted that many people. And I used to say, let's go to this country. I remember I was crying. I don't want to be with survivors. I want to go to a place that nobody will know that we are Jewish. We will be Christians, Catholics, anything. But I don't want to be Jewish. And I remember my father got very mad at me. And he said the only place that a Jew should go is Israel. My father never wanted to go to another place, only to Israel. And when the survivors used to get together Friday or something, they used to dream about what's going to be in Israel. And at the time, they didn't want to talk about what happened.
And I've heard you say that Israel is really where your life began. And so can you share what life was like in the early years when you and your family arrived to Israel?
When we went to Israel, I was 12 years old. We were living in huts. It was not enough buildings that we could go and live there, so we were living in huts. We were running around and we were looking for oranges. Israel has oranges. Israelis used to come to this camp and taught us Hebrew songs. And all of a sudden, I felt loved. I knew that the people that come, they bring us. It was teachers that they hired. They used to teach us Hebrew. And the parents used to run around Israel to find a place where to live. So my parents had very good friends. And they came near Tel Aviv. And it was an Arab place before that. We were living in a building that the Arabs used to keep the horses. And we were happy. The only thing that I remember is that I'm loved. And I wasn't scared to go in place. I used to go out with other kids. And to me, I felt like everybody in Israel loves you. And I started living. I knew what it's a life. It's a different life. Nobody hates me. Nobody hates my parents. And I met my husband, and he was a survivor. He had a terrible time during the war.
It's beautiful to hear that that's when your life began. That's where you met Simon. And actually, I was hoping, Elana, you could share a little bit about Simon's experience, what you know, because I know you've shared the story before. Can you share a little bit about Simon, who he and his family were, and then what happened to him during the war and what took him to Israel?
He was from Lodz. It was a big city there, and he had a very large family, and they were religious Jewish people, but they were also kind of secular. It was kind of that time. So he had an uncle that had gone to Germany. He had an uncle that went to Argentina, or somewhere in, I think so. And his parents, his father was a plumber and a locksmith. And he always said that life was good before the war in Lodz, that they had a lot of family, that they would go to their grandparents' summer home and all the cousins would get together, and he was a happy child. And then he remembered when his parents were sitting around the table, they were saying that the Nazis were going to invade Poland, and his father said they won't defeat the Polish army. The Polish army is strong. And then, of course, they came in and just kind of took over. Poland was not able to defend themselves, and they were moved to a ghetto, the Lodz ghetto. Him and my father and his family, and they were there almost until the end of the war. I think till they were like one of the last people that were still in the ghetto. And his stories in the ghetto were very brutal. He worked with his father as a plumber and a locksmith, and his brothers and his uncle, they all worked together. And then when they finally emptied out the ghetto, they were transported to Auschwitz. And at that point, his father was really kind of too old for them to keep him, and my dad was too young. But they asked my grandfather what he does, and he said he was a plumber and a locksmith, and so they needed him, and they could see he had really strong, healthy hands, so they kept him. And my grandfather said, and I need them to help me. So my grandfather and my grandfather's brother and the three sons all stayed together, and then his mother and one of the sisters had to go to the other side. And my nephew asked my father, what was the last thing you said to your mother? And that was the only time I ever saw my father cry, and we had to stop the tape. But he said in Yiddish, he said to his sister, take care of our mother. And that was the last time they ever saw them. So they were murdered in Auschwitz. His younger sister was only 5 in the ghetto, as you well know. Rumkowski had to give up so many people, so there was a time when he gave up the children. And they forcibly took my aunt. She was 5 years old, and she was killed. But my father and his brothers and his uncle and his father all stayed together. They were not in Auschwitz that long, which is why he never had a tattoo. He was sent to Dachau, and from there he was sent to the different subcamps. And he was liberated he was on the death march and liberated in Tyrol. That was a very quick summary of his experience. And then he went to the displaced persons camp in Bamberg in Germany, and his father was able to go to Israel under an assumed person. It was a doctor that was supposed to go, and he decided in the end he wasn't going to go, so my grandfather went in his place. And then my father left his brothers and secretly went and joined a youth group in the displaced persons camp. and they went to Italy, trained there, and they went illegally on a boat. Morde Hagetaot was the name of the boat, and they almost made it to Palestine, but the British got them and broke the boat, and then he was sent to Cyprus. And he spent time there in Cyprus until his father, who was now in Israel, sent a letter that his son was very young and he needed him, and so he was able to go to Israel, and rebuilding started in Israel. And he was in the army there, and then he met my mother. He was 28 when they got married.
I was 18.
You were 18.
I was not quite 18.
And I remember a story about you saying you were about the age where you were supposed to go into the military, and you did not, right?
My parents were very religious, and they didn't want me to go to be a soldier. They heard such stuff about women that go to the army, and I was the only family that they had. So my father went there, and he said, this is the only family that my wife has, and me, and we survived the Holocaust. And they said, no, the only way that she's staying home is you have to swear that she's very religious. She doesn't go any place Saturday. She doesn't drive. She doesn't eat anything that's not kosher, all that stuff. So my father said, I think that getting married would be better. And the other survivors were talking to my parents. Don't let her marry a survivor. They are all a little smashed. They lived through so much at a very young age. And the funny thing about it, his father made him 5 years younger because they would not let him go to Israel from Cyprus. So all my life, until I came to America and years here, he was always only 5 years older than me. So one day we were sitting and I said something. I said, Simon is this and this age. And his brother said, oh my God, this is not my brother. All the time we are together. My brother was this and this age. And then I knew that he's older. But he was a very nice man.
How did you actually meet him? Where did you meet him?
I met him, I was with other boys and girls, and I didn't think it's time to get married. So, but he used to see me. Everybody knew each other. Mm-hmm. So he said to me, I don't want you to go everywhere someplace. Go back with me, and I want to talk to you. I said, okay. And he said, I have papers to go to America. But my parents have an apartment for me. And if you don't marry me, I'm going to America. I said, no, I don't want to get married. I came home and I told it to my parents, and my mother really made a hassle that I married, that I'm going to live with him, and that's how I got married. I was so gentle to my parents, I didn't want to tell them something that they didn't want. I never told my father or mother, I don't want to listen to you. I'm not going to do it. It was different. Now I see my children, my grandchildren, they have a normal life. Until today, my life is not normal.
It sounds like they knew it was a good match, though.
Yeah, it was a good match. He was a very nice person. And he came to America because he was in the army. It was the Sinai War. In Israel, every war has a name. And we didn't hear from him about 3 weeks because he didn't have on voter rights. He was in Egypt. And his father got a heart. And when I came to visit him, he said, I want my son to go to America. You are young. If he gets killed, you will marry somebody else. But this is my whole life with my son. And let him go to America. About 5 years, we will have one country with the Arabs. We won't fight. We will see that life is to live. We came to America for 5 years to his brother. And then when we wanted to go back, about 7 years, yeah, my oldest daughter already met her husband.
This is Yafa.
Yeah,
Yes.
very young. And she met her husband very young. She was 16. And they said they are not going anyplace. They don't know Hebrew. They don't want to go. They are they have their own friends, and that's why we say.
I want to go back, Elana. You shared your father's story. You said very concisely in a short version, but I'm curious, how were you able to put that story together, either yourself or did he share his story with you?
He shared his story with me, and he shared his story with his grandchildren too. Like I said, he wanted to pass it on. And he also had like a lot of documents that you can fact check every single thing he says. And it's all in black and white. You know, they kept very good records.
Wow. And do you remember also hearing this story then?
Yes, I always grew up knowing my grandfather's story pretty well. And it's interesting because I never really knew my grandma's story as well. He was very, very gentle and quiet and just happy. So it was always hard to conceptualize, oh my God, he went through all these things. And my grandmother always told his story. So we would come over like every day to my grandma's house and she would tell me this story of my grandpa and this one, because as my mom mentioned, he got Parkinson's. And so speaking became harder. As I got older, when I was 18, 19, and could really have these conversations with him, my grandma was always telling his story. And as I get older, I realized that, you know, I think one, she didn't want to tell her story, and two, she always thought his was worse. And so she always thought, well, I won't tell my story. It's not as, I wasn't in Auschwitz. His was worse. And so she didn't call herself a survivor for most of my life. It wasn't until the last few years that she realized, no, actually, I'm a survivor too. So I knew his story very well. And as my mom said, it's really well documented because he was on a lot of these transports. And so, I've seen the documents, and it definitely helps it come full circle to be able to hear it from my mom and my grandmother, and to finally hear her story has been really just important for me.
I wanted to mention that when I was 16, I was really curious about my dad's family. So my parents sent me as a birthday gift to New York, where my father's extended family, the survivors, lived. And so I got a lot of information also from my great uncle, two of my great uncles, my great aunt. And they also were very reluctant to tell me anything. But my one great uncle that had left Germany and was in South America, and I think it was Argentina, maybe Brazil, I don't remember. He had more artifacts. He had pictures that his family had sent him. So I have photos from before the war and letters going back and forth that he was corresponding with his parents, which were my great-grandparents, before the war. So that kind of put it together for me too. And I took notes at the time from them.
And you mentioned that one of the things that really helped your father's family persevere, especially within the camp system, was they were together, right? The grandfather, their father, said, "Oh, I need them," and they were able to remain together throughout the war. But then after the war, with your grandfather going to Israel and then your father going to Cyprus, were his brothers with him, or had they taken a different path at that time?
They all took a different path. They were in the displaced camp in Germany. My grandfather, only thing he could think of was Israel, because before the war in like 1925, he took his family to Israel, to Palestine, and they tried to make it, but the conditions in Palestine in 1925 were horrible. So he went back to Poland. And so when they were in concentration camp, his kids would say to him, "If you would have stayed in Palestine, our mom would be alive." And, yeah. So all he wanted to do was go to Israel. So that was the grandfather. And then my uncle Sam had met his wife in the displaced camp. They reunited there, I should say. And he went to Cincinnati. My great uncle, who was also with them, went to New York, and he just wanted to be there with his extended family there. So they all kind of did their own thing, I think.
Well, and so details that I've heard from both of you, you said, him being in the war was another reason why you wanted to come to America. And then also it sounds like there was family here in Cincinnati. So I'm curious, because I've heard you say that Israel will always be your home. But as a couple, you did make the decision to come to America. Was Cincinnati definitely the place to go because there was family here, or how did you get here?
His brother was here. And we got here. The thing is that he had a family that they went before the war from Poland to other countries, and they survived. And from my side, nobody survived. Not an uncle, not nobody. I never knew anybody of my family. But I have a grandchild or a great-grandchild, and I looked at them. I don't know who they look like. And Ariel's son is named after my father. And in school, he goes to Hebrew school. He's how old?
6.
6. He says, "My name is Kissel." And I thought that nobody will give a name like Kissel. It's a Polish, Yiddish name. And he's happy about it. And there is another Kissel. Tevya is another Kissel. So the two of them, I'm a Kissel and you are a Kissel.
I think that is beautiful, though, that name lives on, and so does his
I have
memory.
so many kids' names that they were killed. I wanted them to survive through the name.
Circling back to the question about how you came here, Grandma, if I'm right, I remember you saying always growing up that you didn't want to come here and you always longed to be in Israel. And I remember being in my whole adulthood, you would always dream of living back there, and they were going to move back there, and then my grandfather got sick. They were going to vacation, have a home there and a home here, and they never got to do that. But you always longed to be in Israel, and you talked about how hard it was when you moved here, and you never felt there was almost like a status of like when you came to America of the survivors. It wasn't easy as a young woman. Everybody treated, they're kind of like high school. They could be snobby, and it was very hard for you.
It was 3,000 survivors in Cincinnati, and we were so close together. But they didn't live long. Most of them died young. The survivors.
And you came straight to Cincinnati because family was here?
I came to New York. Mm-hmm. Simon had cousins in New York, and we stayed in New York a week, and we went to Cincinnati. And I told everybody, whoever wanted to listen, I'm here for 5 years. In 5 years, I'm going back to Israel. We went back to Israel. We didn't have any money, only the money that we saved up for the trip. And we went with Elana and with Yafa, with my other daughter. And to me, Israel was all my life. It was a miracle. Wherever I went, I used to know the story from the Bible that this town was this and this. Because when we were in school, every year we used to go to another city, and the teachers knew that they were all sappers. In the school where I went, it was only two girls, Sean and me, that we were survivors. So they used to tell us, to all of us, what this town was, this from the Bible. And we belong here because 2,000 years ago, people lived here and they told us who lived here. And until today, when Elana came and she said that she's going to Israel to help out, I said, Elana, if I would be younger, I would go too. I'm very happy that you are going. And all the kids went to Israel for a year.
I wanted to add in one thing, if that's okay too, when we were talking about when you came here and how hard it was. I think something that people don't remember is two things. One, these were children from France, from Poland, from, Germany. They weren't, first of all, they didn't all speak the same language. My grandparents spoke Yiddish, but they didn't all speak Yiddish. Some of them spoke only Polish, or, they didn't know Hebrew when they first went to Israel. And so they came to America and they were the survivors that were grouped together and they had so much in common, but they were also so different. Some of them had very different traditions for the holidays. And I think that growing up, I heard how hard it really was for my grandma here. She had no money. They would take whatever they had, they would walk to the bank and save everything they had. They just poured everything they had into their children's education. My grandpa finished high school when he got to Cincinnati because he didn't even have a high school education. He spoke no English. He could really only do things with his hands, work it here because he didn't speak the language. He had no education. She had limited education in English. And, they had this group of people that sometimes they felt really connected to and sometimes they didn't, and their family was back home. And I don't think that people understand how hard it was. I think they see Jews now as they assimilated so well, they've got good jobs, but they, it's really because of all the pouring they did into their children of use your education. I didn't even get to go to high school. And so I think that that's really instilled in my generation and in American Jews now is the importance of education because of how hard it was for them. And also, I don't think that people understand how hard it was in Israel. You mentioned that, also you mentioned in 1925, when they went to Palestine and left. I don't think people realize when these survivors got to Israel, they didn't just walk into these beautiful hospitals, and it was horrible for them in Israel. It was hard for them here.
Yeah, I've heard her refer to living in tents early in Israel, and then to your point, coming here and maybe never finishing school. So it's amazing that your grandfather, finished school, right? And I believe, did he become a plumber in Cincinnati, right?
Well, he had been a plumber all his life in the concentration camps and in Israel, but
he was helping his father.
He had to go to school here to do that. You had to learn the codes. You had to pass tests. He was a master plumber here. He studied hard.
And getting right to work, to your point, because you're providing for a young family, right? And so thank you for bringing up those challenges, that we don't always think about. What is the immigrant experience? How that isn't just hitting the ground running. That really is a rebuilding process. But, and to your point that we did have a pretty vibrant survivor community, we still do. I know survivors still get together.
We used to get together when a baby was born, and bat mitzvahs and weddings, we used to go together. Everybody used to invite somebody else. And it was a hard life. And I wanted to go to Israel very badly. I went back so many times. But what she was talking, the people that survived was my husband's family. He had a big family.
Grandma, I think too, part of the trauma that my mom told me about too, we talked about as I got older, is, I never fully understood, but that must have been so traumatizing for you to leave your parents, knowing your mother had a nervous breakdown when you were younger and she couldn't have more children, and you were like her world and your father's, and then you were here in America, and probably the guilt of being here and not sharing your grandchildren with them every day. And I think you carried a lot of guilt being here, even though you knew that they wanted you here to be with Simon. You didn't feel, you always had a big guilt of being away from your parents.
And there was a song about parents that you leave them and you went away, and I used to cry about it. But I still think that my husband went through a lot more because I had my parents. And when I asked my father why something happened, he used to answer with what was, but in the Bible. Everything was because of I said, my mother felt very bad that she couldn't have any more children. And my father said, well, I told her the story about women from the Bible. They couldn't have children. They told me the whole story. And I used to tell your mother that she is more important than 10 kids.
And what happened to your parents? They stayed in Israel?
My father passed away. He was 72. And my mother came here. After he passed away, she stayed with us for 8 months. And something bit her. And she came to Israel back, and she went to have surgery, like a plastic. And she stayed in the hospital, and they liked her. So they told her, stay here. She was living on the fourth floor. And being in the hospital, and my nephew came to visit, Simon's brother's son. And she said, look at that beautiful soldier. He's all mine. And she went like this, he's all mine. And she died. She had a heart attack. And my father had a heart attack. They had a very hard life.
But thank you for sharing that. And I think even though, as well as you had a hard life, the strength I hear from that story and the love and strength and family, I obviously see in the generations that you have also brought and shared this history with. And
I used to tell her I had the Bible, and I used to tell her every day a story, one story. And she used to say, what is it? Is God again mad at the Jews? And I said, yeah, in a way he was. Okay, good night. And she fell asleep.
well, in the last couple minutes that we have together, this question is both for Elana and Ariel. How has the legacy of being the child and grandchild of survivors impacted your lives?
Well, my parents, I will say that my father was somebody of hope. He had a lot of hope, and he tried to always see the good in people. And I do too. And he would focus on that but he also had a very big mistrust of anyone that wasn't family, anyone that wasn't part of his circle. He had a lot of mistrust. And I think that he also taught us to be very careful, because you don't really know people. You just, really stay with your family. My mother also, family and hope, but also some mistrust.
I actually really agree with that. I think that people see Jews and say they're so insular and they stay with their community, and it's probably a true stereotype, because I think that after the war, people were very distrustful because it was their neighbors who gave them away or their best friends. And so I do think that there is a sense of keeping to yourself and, not being like showy or flashy. You always just kind of keep to yourself because you don't really know other people. And so I do agree that that trauma has passed on. But also I agree the hope, and I just see the strength in my mother and my grandmother. And I think, it really shows that the matriarch of the family has really passed down our closeness and importance to Judaism and family. And I'm really appreciative to my grandma and mom for everything they've given. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to share this story.
Well, thank you all for being part of that. I do have one last question, because as much as your family has done to share this story through our museum, through this series, Ariel, you're also part of the Gutman family. And recently we launched our center, our Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling. And really, the focus of that is sharing incredible stories like this right here in our community. And I'm wondering, what do you hope people will get or be able to glean from this series and all of the different ways we plan on telling stories just like your families?
I hope that it captures reality, because, we look on the internet and we read stories, and, who writes it or whether it's reality, I have no idea. You don't know. And so to have something that is true and accurate is so important that I can pass to my children, like telling these stories, because, like I had mentioned, I don't think that it's going to be understood in my kids' generation that, no, Jews didn't just go from Auschwitz to Israel and it was amazing, and then they came to America. It was horrible and it was hard. And I hope that these stories capture that, and our children can be able to really understand what happened, and not just the big picture of it, but like the small details, because they're so important, and especially in the context of today and anti-Semitism. So I'm so thankful to you, Grandma, for sharing your story. And I know Lev will watch it one day with his kids, and Noah and Ava. And so I'm really thankful.
Yes, and thank you for reminding us of that hope and the resilience that is so very relevant today, right? That we are blessed. And I'm so fortunate to have shared this time with all three of you, and especially Helen. Thank you for sharing a very difficult story that we really can keep alive for generations to come and learn these valuable lessons. So thank you all.
Thank you.
To make sure you don't miss an episode, subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Let us know your thoughts on this episode. Our email is in the show notes. You can also connect with us on Instagram and TikTok at Holocaust and Humanity, and X and Facebook at CincyHHC. Hear My Story is a production of the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. The center's mission is to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust inspire action today. This series is part of the Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling and is generously supported by Margaret and Michael Valentine. Visit us in person at Historic Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio, or online at holocaustandhumanity.org. Executive producers are David Wise and Jackie Congedo. Managing producer is Ann Thompson. Consulting producer is Joyce Kamen. Technical producer is Robert Mills. Technical director is Josh Emerson. Select music is by Kick Lee. This is recorded at the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center in Cincinnati, Ohio.